Hi there, welcome back to the archives. So in this episode, I want to talk about some of the Ndongo rulers and leaders, okay? To get into Njinga's story. She was born in 1582. Before she was born into a royal family, okay? So she was from royal lineage that stretched all the way back to the founding of Ndongo. And so the founder and the first historical king that's recorded of Ndongo is Ngola Kiluanje Samba. So he took power for only a few decades before Njinga's birth, and he reigned from 1515 to 1556. So he's said to be the first king. I'm not sure what it looked like before, because remember beforehand they were in the Kingdom of Congo, things were happening, right? But he was the first one to rule Ndongo Kingdom. Okay? He set the stage for a dynasty that was very dominant, and he restored a lot of fractures in the kingdom, is what it says here. And he even restored the murder of his son by a jealous uncle, whom he and his wife had wreaked vengeance. And you see that even in Njinga's story, right? You see that her own brother, Mbande, because he was threatened, he didn't want anybody to stand in his way, he killed his other brother, he killed Njinga's brother. Well, they were all three of them were siblings. And then he killed Njinga's own son because he didn't want her son to be the heir. So again, you see this insecurity, this fragile thing, again, not just in Africa. Remember, even in Jesus' story, don't you remember? The emperor at that time was so threatened that he heard that a baby was going to be born in the region who was going to overthrow him, and so he had all of the babies killed. So this is not a new thing where it's like Africans were sacrificing themselves and they were backstabbing each other. Unfortunately, it seems like it's just a human nature thing. I don't know what that is. What is the neuroscience of that? I'm so threatened that I have to kill off all of the male born children and men in my family just to make sure that nobody takes my power. And so that was happening before Njinga and her brothers, okay? And so according to the tradition, Ngola Kiluanje Samba, the first ruler, he began his rule sometime after 1515, like I said, and he consolidated a lot of power in Ndongo by maintaining internal peace, and he expanded the country's borders, conquering neighboring cities. You see this in other places as well too, including the Ashanti region, which is where the Ashanti Kingdom, which is where I'm from, right? Modern day Ghana on the west side. So in 1518, he sought to enhance his power to become the most powerful, to make Congo Kingdom and Ndongo the most powerful. Okay, and so he sent 2 ambassadors to Portugal. Remember, the Portuguese were there before 1515. So he sends them to Portugal to seek trade and broader cultural relations. And then there's another mission in 1520 to Portugal, but it didn't have as much of an effect. The kings who followed him were expert military leaders and they were state builders. Okay? His successor was Ndambi Angola. He reigned from 1556 to 1561. Okay, he is said to have ascended to the throne after murdering all but 2 of his siblings. Again, why would you murder your siblings just to get to the throne? It's men in power have just been diabolical. And so the surviving pair only narrowly escaped the fate because they ran to a neighboring kingdom. So if they hadn't run off, he probably would have killed all of his siblings. Okay? So this is what, and we have to remember this, and I think about this a lot, right? As somebody who's from a royal lineages, my father's from a royal family, my father's father's from a royal family, my father's mother's from a royal family, my mother's father and my mother's mother, right? So for me, And that's why I'm really hard on my family, because this kind of gruesome vengeance and I'm killing my brother for this, like, to me, I feel like that is part of our lineage. And as Africans, we have to contend with that, right? A couple years ago, I tried to write a paper talking about narcissism and asking Africans to contend with our narcissism. Narcissism to me, is like a form of white supremacy. It's all about supremacy, culture, domination. I am the bigger. I am the baddest. As Ashantis, we do that, right? We think we're very superior to others, and especially from the circles that I grew up in. I just ask us to contend with some of this. Right? When we're all in 2026 unable to completely be cohesive, people are backstabbing, this is a history. We have to face it if we want to do different. Right? It's just so, I don't know. I think a lot of us Africans need to face this. Because Yesubai enye, to say Yesubai no enye, Okana omubufu, na yidiwatem, na yesewudi, but Yesubai enye, wumpa no kra, meka no kra, Yesubai enye. This is not, this is not good, right? And again, this has nothing to do with religion, and then they say God, because the Europeans were doing the same thing. Including the Jesuits, including the Catholics, like, it was, the world's over. You see this also in India, right? Razia's story, you see this, with the Trung sisters in Vietnam, you see this in China, where folks in positions of power from day one have just been unable to negotiate power in a way that's just not as diabolical as it could be less. Okay, so basically, yeah, he came into power, the second king, he just done everybody out, boop, 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 boop. Look at that, I'm the king. Two of his siblings escaped, and that's the only reason they survived. Later rulers, including Njinga, considered human sacrifice. They also engaged in human sacrifice. Some people say she also engaged in cannibalism, and folks were drinking blood and sleeping with this dead corpse. And again, it was in Africa. It was also in Europe. It was also in Asia. Okay? So when they tell you the Africans did human sacrifice, yes. So did the Europeans. That doesn't make it right. It means across the globe, something was happening. So this is basically some of the rulers. So the third ruler here was Ngola Kiluanje Kia Ndambi. Okay, he started his reign in 1561 after his father's death, and shortly after the arrival of the first official mission from Portugal in the spring of 1561. So after the first one, his father dies, he becomes the ruler. His dad's the one who killed everybody off, remember? Portuguese are now starting to come even more. It says over here, after 5 days of arriving in Cabasa, the Portuguese were allowed to enter the king's headquarters, and this was situated in a well-watered area of the city and was protected by large palm trees. So again, because everybody thinks Africa was like primitive and uncivilized before the Europeans came, I just want to share this part because it's not true. So it says one of the Jesuit priests, Father Mendes, was impressed by the imposing physical appearance of the king. Ndambi of Angola, who was in the final year of his reign, the priest wrote, one of the tallest in the land, like a giant and very strong. Ndambi of Angola was most likely dressed in the attire and adornments that would have become the official regalia of Ndongo royalty in the years to come. There was a red feather. Feathers are really popular. Nzinga wore a lot of colored feathers in her hair. A red feather, most likely from a peacock. In his hair, he had red clothing covering his chest and shoulder, and a cloth made of sheepskin with black and white spots covering him from the waist down. His body would have been splashed with powder, signifying the spiritual and military esteem that he had attained as a result of his prowess on the battlefield. His impressive physical appearance reflected his tremendous power. Okay, so when the Portuguese first met him, they were just like, who is this man? He controlled 500 principalities. and their leadership paid him tribute. So again, Africans were doing very well, thank you very much, before we encountered the European. We weren't walking around naked, contrary to popular belief, although yes, nakedness was happening and that's okay. But especially the royals, they did cover themselves, lots of jewelry. In the Gold Coast, it said the Portuguese came and they saw gold just in the waters, right? Ghana was traditionally called the Gold Coast because we had so much gold that the Portuguese could not believe it, right? Lots of riches, lots of wealth. So when they tell you Africa's always been primitive, Africa's always been poor, that's not true. They're lying to you, okay? Read a history book, which is what we're doing. And so, according to the Portuguese missionaries, Ndambi at Angola was regarded as a divine. He was almost saw like as a god, and he regarded himself as a lord of the rain, apparently. His majestic seat was made of palms. Listen to the Portuguese missionaries explain the tenets of Christianity, because this is the first time he's like, what is Christianity? Well, you guys only have one God? Huh, okay. So he was suspicious of their motives. He was really suspicious of, so it's not like we were completely blindsided. Especially in Ndambi, Angola, he was like, I feel like you guys are using religion as a guise to get our land, and I'm going to keep an eye on you. And he was right. In the end, he was right. They use the missionaries and religion as a facade to get the land. Remember, was it Desmond Tutu who said, when they came, we had the land, and they had the religion. When they left, we had the religion and they had the land. So religion was used as a carrot to kind of like put us in a trance while the Europeans went and took all of our land. And so he was suspicious, still gave them permission to begin their mission work in Kabasa. Biggest mistake of our African lives. I don't know why we ever gave the Europe, because I don't think we really thought the Europeans were as diabolical. Okay, but they had a different level of, and so he selected 15 to 20 of his own children to help lead these advisors, okay? So with the arrival of the Portuguese and their religious and political plans, it said it created a dilemma for the rulers of Ndongo. The Jesuit missionaries practiced a religion that had the potential to undermine the spiritual and legal power of the king and his advisors. To this day, I do believe that Christianity has weakened Africans. And I think this is what they're trying to get at, right? Christians get really offended, especially the Black Christians who are like, I'm a Christian myself, and I don't think that's really offensive. I think it's part of the truth, right? They knew what they were doing. It was to weaken it. Now you don't have as many people to turn to in your corner. You just have one God and one God alone, and maybe Jesus Christ, right? Even Mary is witchcraft and demonic because you're worshiping false idols. So the original leaders thought they knew. They're like, I think they're trying to weaken us politically, and it worked, right? So the Portuguese brought not only guns, but also different cultural values regarding spirituality, justice, notions of social status, inherited with rights and rule. They brought in freedom and slavery, served them in captivity. So a lot of polarities were introduced by the Europeans, which is not unlike what we were already doing either. And so Ndambi, Angola allowed the Portuguese visitors to remain in Kabasa, right? He even let the Jesuits build a school. And but this welcome did not last, okay? When he died sometime in 1561, his son Ngola Kiluanje Kia Ndambi, or Ngola Kiluanje, he took power of Ndongo, and he changed things. Kiluanje turned against the Portuguese, convinced that their real motives was to spy on his land. So he's like, I don't trust these guys. I don't trust the Portuguese. I think my father was too nice. It ended with me. And so there was a whole change. He imprisoned some of the priests and other members of the delegation, and even local Mbundus who were siding with the Portuguese. He said, all of you guys are snitches, you're spies, we're not doing this. And so he expelled a lot of the delegation back to Portugal. He sent them to the back to the coast under military escort, and eventually he released some of the priests, and later he allowed some of them to stay behind. One of them stayed for 10 years and he died. And so when he came into power, he just changed things. He's like, no, we're not working with the Jesuits. By the end of his reign, the country's border had expanded significantly, and Ndongo had developed from a small province located more than 200 miles from the port of Luanda to what is basically, it encompassed all of the Kimbundu speaking people that were living in the southern borders of Congo Kingdom and the lands south of the Kwanza River. So he focused on expanding territory. And after that, the next ruler is Nzinga's grandfather. Okay? His name was Kasenda, or his actual name was Ngola Kilombo Kia Kasenda. He reigned from 1575 to 1592, and that was Njinga's grandfather. Okay, so you have to remember her grandfather was a ruler, her father was a ruler, her brother became a ruler, and then she took it from her brother. So she comes from a long line of Ndongo rulers. Okay, so her grandfather was Kasenda. He began his rule with a political disadvantage, right? Because now they're kind of at beef with Portugal. It was also difficult for her grandfather because he was not a direct descendant of the first ruling founder. Remember the first guy? He wasn't technically a member of his family, but it was a different lineage. And so it was a little bit of, he had a tough time, right? He had a tough time. He triumphed in a bloody coup. He wasn't interested in changing the direction of the country. He took up arms against his enemies. Some were intimidated by him. Others were forced back to fold. And so he expanded the boundaries of Ndongo and gained power of several regions. But it started to coincide with the return of the Portuguese. And basically, this protracted the military, the economic, and the spiritual crisis just became worse. Okay, and so the Portuguese had been strengthening their relationship with Congo between 1565 and 1575. But by 1574, the king of Congo had given them permission to build a small settlement on the island of Luanda. Big mistake, in my opinion. Okay, and so and Luanda was Congo. Remember this, the Kingdom of Congo, and the Ndongo Kingdom, two separate but under the same kind of region. Okay, so the first thing the Portuguese did was to build a temporary church on the island. So now the Portuguese are like, yeah, we got Luanda, we're building our church. They put a cross there, and it just more and more Portuguese started coming. Okay, they brought more military and civilian force, and the Portuguese military conquest inland became a real threat to Ndongo. And so, yeah, the fleet arrived on the port of Luanda on February 20th, 1575. And after he was alerted of the arrival of the Portuguese, Kasenda wasted no time in contacting them. Remember, that's Nzinga's grandfather. And so Njinga's grandfather, he's a leader. He offers the Portuguese enslaved people provisions, livestock, and other goods. Welcome to our land. We kicked you off. My son kicked you off, but welcome back. Here are all of these enslaved people. Here's all of these provisions. It's all yours. Why would you do that? And so in exchange, the Portuguese gave him presents from the king of Portugal. And so you see the relationship starting to kind of flourish there. But then it deteriorated because he was convinced that the Portuguese were intent on conquering his kingdom, right? He's like, oh yeah, let me remember when my predecessor said, and yeah, I think they're coming here for the land, and so things start to fall apart. By March of 1582, which is a year of Njinga's birth, the king had sent so many more people to the king of Angola had sent so many more people to the region to fight. And so you see that the Portuguese are starting to gain more and more and more territory. You see that in the video as well, too, on Netflix. And so in 1586, there was even more disaster when all but 20 of 700 of Ndongo troops drowned as they attempted to cross the Lukala River. So he's losing his own men to Mother Nature. Okay, not even just to battle, just they're drowning. Literally, they're drowning in the river. And so this is not going well for Njinga's grandfather. Territories are being brutalized by the Portuguese. The Portuguese are not even trying to be friendly. They're just brutal. They're humiliating people. They're destructing. They're burning down villages. Right? They're killing livestock, the provisions, honey, oil. Right, houses full of salt. They're taking all the salt. They're sending them and making money off of the salt. It's just brutal, right? It's just brutal. The Portuguese accepted more enslaved people, and then they went ahead and decapitated the Lord, right? So the guy's like, we'll give you enslaved people. And they're like, they just took the enslaved people and then killed them anyway. So the Portuguese are starting to play really dirty. They began gruesome practices of cutting the noses of people off. What is wrong? So the Portuguese, again, you see this even in American culture with the lynchings. They would cut off penises and keep black male penises as souvenirs. The Portuguese were cutting off noses and keeping the noses as souvenirs. So it says during the operation, this is on page 27. I'm not making this up. The Portuguese began the gruesome practice of cutting off the noses of people they killed in the wars and sending them back to the Portuguese camps as trophies. In one engagement, 619 noses were cut off from fallen Ndongo soldiers. In another, so many Ndongo soldiers were killed that the Portuguese had to employ 20 porters to carry all of the severed noses to their headquarters. In another account, the Portuguese forces killed so many people that soldiers were reported to have nowhere to walk but on top of them. And I wrote here the Bison Skull Mountain in North America. Remember with the indigenous folks, they killed all of those bisons, and then they had the mountain of skulls, and they were just standing there. And so you see this thing of, same thing in Cambodia, I remember, and it's brutal. And so the campaign against Ndongo was not only a war of conquest, but also slave raiding conquest. That's what it was. They needed more and more and more African bodies to send to Brazil and other parts of the world to feed the slave trade, right? Because the plantations, now they've got sugar plantations they need people to fill. And so the Portuguese are just like one track mind, tunnel vision, kill, kill, kill. What you don't kill, bring them abroad to Brazil so they can work on the sugar plantations. And so between 1575 and 1590, the Portuguese exported as many as 50,000 mbundus to Brazil as a result of their wars and slave trading operations against the Ndongos. So yes, Africans were complicit, but at the same time, this is not what they asked for. They didn't see this level of disrespect, right? Broken treaties, broken promises, or we're just going to use your enslaved people like you use them here to kind of work. No, they put them all, pack them like sardines on the ships, and the Africans are like, they don't treat these enslaved people well. So, yeah, despite all the setbacks her grandfather Kasenda faced, he basically still fiercely fought the Portuguese, and they did have some success. It says that they had some success, but he wasn't able to maintain Ndongo's integrity despite some of the impressive victories. By the time of his death in 1592, he had already lost control of many of the regions and many of the noble people that were on his side. And so it was rough. It was rough. The Portuguese found their way in. They're making they're creating divisions, divide and conquer. They're whispering in this noble person's ear, oh, this family did this. And so there's divisions, and now the noble people are kind of turning against them. And it's just it's a little bit of a hot mess, right? It's a little bit of a hot mess, but they still try. They still try to persevere. So after his death, after her grandfather's death in 1592, two more of Njinga's relatives held power before she became queen. Okay, so after Kasenda died, his son Mbande at Angola takes over, and then the second of his grandsons is Njinga's brother. So when her grandfather dies, her father takes control. And again, you see some of that in the video where her father gets killed, and then her brother kills his brother that was supposed to take it over and kills her son. It's also important, they didn't show it in the docuseries, but her brother had her sterilized. So these are some of the Ndongo leaders I wanted to share, okay? So until next time, I'm going to keep going. We're going to get into a little bit of Njinga now.